Thanks for staying with us. The International Court of Justice will now begin deliberations on South Africa's genocide case against Israel. The court is expected to rule on possible emergency measures later this month. But a ruling on the genocide allegations will only follow later. South Africa is seeking preliminary orders to compel Israel to stop its military campaign in Gaza. Yesterday, it formally accused Israel of subjecting Palestinians in Gaza to acts of genocide. The 8-member legal team told the court that the latest war is part of decades of Israeli oppression of Palestinian Israel. Today defended itself, saying it has a right to defend itself under international humanitarian law. Joining us to expand on this is Aisha Kaji, who's the international relations expert, and Andrew Feinsten, who's a former ANC MP and author. A very good afternoon to you both. Welcome to Newzroom Africa, and thank you so much for your time. I mean, we know that this is one of the biggest cases ever to come before an international court. What South African lawyers are essentially asking for is that the court order an immediate halt to Israeli military operations. What are the merits of such a case? Aisha, perhaps starting off with you.
Well, given that we've seen a genocide literally unfolding in real time on our screens, there is little doubt that what South Africa presented yesterday is actually happening. And as South Africa posited, constitutes grounds that there's of plausibly genocidal action on the part of Israel, and therefore grounds for provisional interim measures, including the cessation of military operations by Israel. Israel's attempt to rebuff that today was weak. It focused on a technicality of what it designated a unispute, claiming there was no real dispute between South Africa and Israel, that they hadn't had enough time to respond to South Africa's notes verbale, etc., and obviously hoping to have this case dismissed on a technicality without presenting any substantive evidence-based rebuttal of South Africa's evidence-based submission yesterday that Israel is indeed committing genocide in Gaza and has shown both the intent to commit genocide and complicity in genocide.
Yeah. Andrew, what do you make of this? I mean, Aisha speaks about Israel's position. I mean, we know that it's vehemently denied the accusations brought by South Africa. In fact, Israel's government spokesperson was arguing that Hamas had genocidal intent when it perpetrated an act of genocide on Israel's soil on the 7th of October. He also said that the history will then judge South Africa for abetting the modern heirs of the Nazis. How should we begin to interpret such a position in your view?
Well, I think how we should interpret it as people trying to defend the indefensible. And I think that I was actually surprised that Israel even tried to defend this case because, as Aisha has spelt out very eloquently, it is so obviously a case of genocide. And I think what Israel is doing, what we've seen from their government spokespeople and what we saw from their lawyers today, is that they're really struggling for any sort of meaningful response. So we saw a continued repetition of falsehoods that have already been debunked even by the Israeli media itself, things about the hospitals, trying to justify why they have bombed hospitals, killing babies in incubators and people receiving treatment. I mean, this sort of stuff that these were control centers, that these have tunnels going backwards and forwards and that Hamas are using these, have actually been debunked by elements of the Israeli media, not just, Palestinians suffering all of this in Gaza and Palestinian journalists, many of whom, as we know, have been killed. So, what we're seeing Israel doing is what the brilliant Palestinian academic Edward Said described as power repeating untruths until they have the force of truth. Except I think that South Africa's submission was so powerful that Israel are not going to get to the last bit of that, the force of truth, with respect to saying that history will judge South Africa for bringing this action. And I want to make very clear that I'm saying this as a Jew, as the son of a Holocaust survivor, as the person who introduced the first ever motion on the Holocaust in the history of the South African parliament, as someone who has lectured at Auschwitz, where dozens of my mother's family were murdered. I've lectured there on genocide prevention. And the reality is that my mother and others after the Holocaust used the words never again. That never again should the world see what we saw in Auschwitz and elsewhere. And never again didn't just apply to Jews. It applied to all human beings. And for Israel at this point to invoke the Holocaust, to attempt to justify its genocidal behavior in Palestine that we have been able to witness with our own eyes every day, is actually a remarkable and extraordinary insult to the memory not just of the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust, but to the 12 million people who were murdered in that Holocaust. And it reminds me of the repulsive moment when the Israeli ambassador turned up at the UN wearing a yellow Star of David. This is what my mother's family had to wear when they were carted off to be murdered like animals in Auschwitz. And the Israeli government representative had the audacity to wear that in the UN Security Council while his state's military was committing unspeakable slaughter against innocent people in Palestine.
Andrew, that's very powerful. Aisha, as we try and make sense of this, I mean, Andrew speaking about a very personal moment, given the fact that genocide is different to war crimes or crimes against humanity in that it seeks extermination, much as the Nazis sought of the Jewish people. How crucial do you think, I mean, Andrew touches on it briefly, is the focus on the destruction of Palestinian life in these arguments that are being put forward as South Africa argues its case?
Well, South Africa argued that not only is Israel killing Palestinians with the intent to commit genocide, but is also imposing upon Palestinians conditions that will lead to the extermination of the people of Gaza, basically, of the Palestinians in Gaza, due to withholding of food, of aid, of water, of power, of humanitarian assistance, of medical equipment and assistance and personnel. The withholding of all of those things collectively, and particularly the withholding of water, has imposed famine conditions on Gaza, as Adila Hassim so eloquently stated yesterday. 4 out of every 5 people undergoing starvation in the world currently are in Gaza. And the withholding of potable water for cleaning, cooking, and drinking has meant that the rates of children with diarrhea in Gaza has gone up 2,000% since October 7th. Now, those 2 facts alone show an intent to destroy this population, as I said, very eloquently argued by our entire legal team yesterday on behalf of South Africa. For Israel to say it is allowing in humanitarian aid, it is establishing field hospitals, that the rhetoric of genocide can be excused due to the events of October 7th, all of that, I'm sorry, is just purely fictionalized. Firstly, genocide or the intent to incite genocide or genocidal rhetoric is not justifiable under any conditions whatsoever. Genocide is a very, very serious claim, as you stated. And South Africa has shown at least plausible evidence of genocide being undertaken and of intent of genocide or incitement to genocide. So having said that, Israel's rebuttal has been particularly weak, and the incidents it cites of humanitarian aid, of allowing in aid, etc., of establishing field hospitals, have pretty much all of them have taken place only since the date, the 29th of December, that South Africa brought this case to the ICJ. Prior to that, very little, if anything.
Andrew, it's been said and spoken to, I mean, South Africa's support for the Palestinian cause having very deep roots. But as we try and perhaps broaden the discussion and look at exactly how deep these roots are, where does politics and opportunism fit into this picture?
So I've been asked this a great deal, and people back in South Africa, because I'm in London now, have been saying, we're only doing this because there's an election a few months away. Now, the reality is that we all know that our politicians have failed us in certain very important respects in terms of governance, in terms of corruption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this notion that political motives are either all pure or all evil is unfortunately not the way the world works. Politicians do things for multiple different reasons, and some of those reasons are good and some of those reasons are awful. So, yes, of course, there might be some calculation that South Africa, again, taking the moral high ground on the global stage, reflects well on our government. And it does. The outpouring of support for South Africa's action around the world that I experienced yesterday in 12 hours of interviews and talks to various parts of the world was just overwhelming. But my hope is that our politicians would actually draw from this, that what made us extraordinary in the lead up to 1994, to get to 1994, and in those immediate years after 1994, the fact that we managed to overcome a system of racist oppression and that we managed to live generally harmoniously together as a very diverse country is an extraordinarily powerful thing. And I would hope that it motivates our politicians to remind themselves that they are servants of the people of South Africa, as the father of our democracy, Nelson Mandela, used to remind us as MPs, and that we are accountable to the people who elect us and who at the end of the day pay our salaries, which I think most politicians, not just in South Africa, but around the world, seem to have forgotten. So I think, yes, of course, there could be narrow political motives, but I think there are far broader and far more laudatory motives as well. And I think we must first of all remember that Cyril Ramaphosa is someone who was engaged in the peace negotiations in Northern Ireland. And I think this is perhaps the terrain on which he feels incredibly comfortable, perhaps more comfortable than actually trying to run a government. Second of all, the roots of that struggle are extremely, extremely deep. Let us not forget that Nelson Mandela not only described the Israeli-Palestinian issue as the moral issue of our time, but he also said that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. And for many, many decades before 1994, the Palestinian struggle for liberation and the South African struggle for liberation were fraternal struggles. They were very closely linked and related. And then we need to add to that the reality that Israel, the state of Israel, was probably the closest ally of the apartheid South African state on the planet, that it provided apartheid South Africa not just with political and diplomatic support, but with weaponry. It helped us become a nuclear power. And while we have changed, and yes, we face many, many governmental challenges, and I experienced that very directly, but at the same time, Israel has not changed from the entity that was the closest ally of the apartheid South African regime and continues to behave in exactly the same way it always have, and many would argue, in fact, in a far worse way more recently.
Absolutely. Aisha, we know that this decision will probably take weeks, though the full case is likely to take years. It's also a case which has drawn international attention and protesters from both sides to the courthouse. What would you think it represents in terms of what it says about South Africa, how we're seen as a country on a global scale with this cause?
I think South Africa has shown itself to be very courageous in bringing this case, but it's also very symbolic that South Africa is the one state out of the 153 states parties to the Genocide Convention, that South Africa is the state that brings this case to the ICG, because South Africa, with its history of apartheid, is uniquely positioned to understand not only the current apartheid policies within Israel and within the territory, the Palestinian territory it occupies, both in the West Bank and Gaza. And these apartheid policies have been confirmed by no less than former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, former Archbishop Tutu of South Africa, etc. So very well established apartheid policies. But also given that we were perhaps the sort of training ground for apartheid globally in South Africa under, the National Party regime here, the fact that we have been, the state, courageous enough to bring this case to the ICJ, even when very powerful nations such as the US and the UK and other Western European nations have refused to even consider that war crimes or ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity are happening in Gaza. That we have brought a case of genocide to the ICJ speaks very much symbolically and will tarnish the reputation of Israel quite irreparably, given that this is the first genocide that is happening that we are seeing happen as it happens, live streamed to our mobile phones and computers, as it were, because of the technology we have nowadays. Prior to this, findings of genocide have been largely post facto, or at least they happened towards the end of that genocide, attempted genocide period, such as in Rwanda, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Darfur, etc. The fact that we are actually able to see this genocide through video evidence, through images, through text, through all kinds of audio clips, video clips, etc., coming straight out from Gaza on the ground is irrefutable. And this is something Israel is not going to be able to hide from the world, despite its attempts to control communications, despite the fact that sometimes a single image a journalist may take, or a citizen journalist may take several hours to get an image across or out of Gaza. It still is happening. It's irrefutable. It's happening before our eyes. There is no excuse for us as civilians anywhere in the world, or for states anywhere in the world to use that tried and tested old rhetoric of we didn't know, as so many white people did in South Africa, for example, when the crimes of apartheid were exposed during the TRC. So many people said we didn't know. Well, that excuse just doesn't hold, not for individuals and not for states.
And very lastly, Andrew, just in closing, what would you say this case does for South Africa's image on the global scale?
I saw yesterday a combination of things. The one was seeing South Africans extremely proud of our country. And when we saw the diversity of the legal team, the quality of that legal team, the quality of the submission, which really, by comparison to Israel's submission today, I mean, we are talking, South Africa looked as though it was a postgraduate university student, while Israel felt like a kindergarten child, to give it some sort of analogy of the sort of different levels of quality. So I saw South Africans standing proud yesterday, reminding ourselves of why we have taken this global moral stance, because of those people who remain silent in the face of our own apartheid, first of all. But second of all, I have seen an outpouring of gratitude to South Africa, from Nelson Mandela Square in Ramallah in occupied Palestine to, audiences. I spoke at a variety of audiences yesterday, one of which was a music concert with a whole lot of young people who I didn't expect to know that much about the detail of the ICJ case. And when it was mentioned that I was from South Africa and had worked with Nelson Mandela, this audience of very young people at an incredibly loud music concert just started shouting their support for South Africa. And the media, both traditional media and social media, has been generally incredibly positive about South Africa's presentation yesterday. So I think it's going to restore some of the moral standing we had in the world as a consequence of our remarkable struggle against apartheid and the way in which we managed to establish a democratic state. Of course, there have been concerns about the danger of would Israel's allies, and as those, as was mentioned, these are very powerful states, are they going to try and penalize South Africa in some way economically. The reality is Israel's allies, Western European countries, the UK and primarily the US, haven't been great friends of ours on the economic front or any other front since we became a democracy. You know, I was very involved in economic policy and financial matters when I was in Parliament. And we were sent off to Washington, to Berlin, to London, to hear about the sort of economy we had to run in South Africa when we were a democracy, conforming to what was called the Washington Consensus. And we were basically told very explicitly that in return we would receive massive amounts of foreign direct investment, which has never come to pass. So the amount of economic damage that could be done to the South African economy, I think, is incredibly limited. I think what is far more likely is that this will create a buoyancy about South Africa in the global community. And I think, if anything, the responses, regardless of how the ICJ finds, the response is going to be greater support globally for South Africa in all of the dimensions that we require. You know, our friends, as Nelson Mandela said before he was president, when he was first released, when interviewed in the United States of America, America's enemies are not our enemies.
Yeah.
And I think that that's extremely important. And I think that we have probably, over the last 24, 48 hours, we've gained a lot more friends than enemies around the world.
Aisha, perhaps let me end with you. I know I did say it was the last question, but when it comes to the ruling by the International Court of Justice, should it rule in favor of South Africa, what would it mean for the people of Palestine? Just really trying to get a sense of the bigger scope and the importance of this case.
Well, I think we need to make a distinction between whether it rules in favor now in terms of preventative or provincial measures, interim measures that South Africa has urgently asked for, and in the long term, whether it rules that South Africa has proven a case of genocide against Israel. Now, in the urgency of the provisional measures application, I think the impact on Palestinian lives in Gaza will be profound if the court does see fit, as it should see fit, given precedents in the Gambia-Myanmar case against the Rohingya, in terms of the Rohingya genocide, against Myanmar, and also in other cases, Bosnia-Herzegovina, etc. It should rule for at least some urgent provisional measures. Whether those will be the full set of provisional measures that South Africa asked for, including a complete cessation of military operations by Israel in Gaza, remains to be seen. But even a ceasefire right now would mean very, very much to Palestinians in Gaza, given that hundreds are being killed every day and thousands are being injured every day. Advocate Hashim made the point, which was reiterated by her colleagues, that what Israel has essentially done is it's used its policies of so-called advance warning to herd people into ever-shrinking enclaves and then bomb them and bombard them in so-called safe areas and refugee camps where they are sitting ducks. And that's what's currently happening. So we need to urgently reverse at least what is happening on the ground on a day-to-day basis right now. Get in food, get in clean water, get in medical equipment, supplies and personnel. Stop the famine in Gaza, stop the disease that is spreading rampantly. That in itself will be sufficient in the short term.
Yeah.
In the long term, what it will prove if South Africa wins this case of proving genocide, what will happen is it will really give teeth to this edict, the UN's own edict of never again that it brought about after the Holocaust during World War II, that never again will we allow genocide. Well, unfortunately, as a world, we have allowed genocide over and over since then. But South Africa, in proving this case, will really give teeth to this never again, because states will be less likely, Israel and others, to actually try to commit genocide on portions of their populations or territory they occupy.
Thank you so much. Let me thank you both for your time and very thorough analysis there. Aisha Kaji, who's an international relations expert, as well as Andrew Feinstein, who's a former ANC MP and author. Thank you for your time. That, of course, brings us to, as we head to the top of the hour, 4 o'clock Central African time, where